The Mafia boss caught his Maid breastfeeding his son. What he did next shocked everyone. Jasmine Carter stood by the door of the nursery, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was breaking every rule that had been set by the Castellano family, the rules that had kept her safe in this luxurious prison. But today, she couldn't stand by any longer. Marco's cries had become too much to bear, his desperate sobs echoing through the hallways of the mansion. No one had come to help. The pediatrician had left with yet another prescription that hadn't worked. The nanny had quit after 2 weeks of sleepless nights. And Dominic Castellano, the man who controlled everything in this city, stood helpless in the hallway. His power couldn't fix his son's suffering. Jasmine had been working in this grand mansion for 6 months now, her hands always busy, her mind always focused on the next task. But something about the way Marco cried tugged at her heart in a way she couldn't ignore. She had lost her own daughter 3 months ago. The grief was still raw, still sharp. Her body, still full of milk she hadn't been able to give her own child, now begged her to act. As she made her way up the grand staircase to the nursery, her worn sneakers barely made a sound on the polished marble floors. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. She reached the nursery door, where 2 bodyguards stood. They looked exhausted, just as helpless as everyone else in the house. "Mr. Castellano said no one goes in," one of the guards said, his voice lacking the usual authority. Jasmine looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "I can help him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. After a long pause, the guard stepped aside. Inside the nursery, Dominic was cradling his son in his arms, the child's tiny body stiff with discomfort. His face was twisted in agony, his cries still filling the room. Dominic looked up as Jasmine entered, his dark eyes hard, unreadable. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she made her decision. She walked over to him and gently took Marco from his arms. Her body recognized the weight of the child, the familiar feeling of holding a baby. The same sensation she had felt with her own daughter. Jasmine glanced up at Dominic, who was watching her intently. She didn't know what to expect, but she couldn't let this child suffer any longer. "I lost my daughter 3 months ago," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I still have milk. If Marco is hungry and can't tolerate formula, I can help." The room fell into an eerie silence, the tension thick in the air. Dominic's eyes searched her face, as if trying to read her soul. Then, slowly, he placed Marco in her arms. As the baby instinctively turned toward her, seeking comfort, Jasmine began to nurse him. The soft sucking sounds were the only noise in the room, the peaceful rhythm of it slowly easing the tension. Dominic stood there, watching them. His usually cold, unfeeling demeanor had softened just a fraction. Something shifted in his eyes. For the first time, Jasmine felt as if he truly saw her. The man who had always been the embodiment of power, who controlled everyone around him, was now witnessing an act of pure, unselfish kindness. Jasmine's body ached as she held Marco close, the milk flowing freely. Her own grief, the pain of losing her daughter, seemed to melt away in that moment. She was doing something good, something right, for someone else's child. And as she looked up at Dominic, she saw something she hadn't expected. He wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. He was grateful. For the first time, she saw a flicker of humanity in him, something soft beneath the hardened exterior. As Marco's cries subsided and he fell into a peaceful sleep, Jasmine finally allowed herself to breathe. She had done it. She had saved the child, even if only for a moment. But in that moment, something had changed. And Dominic Castellano, the man who had built an empire on fear and control, found himself humbled by the simple, beautiful act of a woman who had nothing but love to give. Dominic Castellano stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Jasmine as she carefully held his son in her arms. The room, once filled with the sound of Marco's desperate cries, was now silent, save for the faint sound of the baby nursing peacefully. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she continued to rock the child, her body reacting instinctively to the familiar rhythm of motherhood. In that moment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since the loss of her own daughter. The weight of Marco in her arms felt right, like she was finally able to offer comfort to a child in need. Dominic's gaze never left her, and as she glanced up at him, She saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before: vulnerability. He wasn't the cold, distant mafia boss anymore. In this room, with the soft light spilling through the curtains, he seemed human. His usual rigid posture softened, and for a brief moment, he seemed to lose the harsh edge that had defined him for so long. Jasmine could feel the tension in the air, but it was different now. It wasn't the oppressive weight of fear or control. It was something lighter, something more fragile. She kept her focus on Marco, unwilling to look too closely at Dominic, afraid that if she did, the fragile moment would break. But Dominic did not move. He stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. It was as though he was waiting for something, unsure of what to do next. Jasmine felt a knot of anxiety twist in her stomach. She wasn't sure what had made her act so boldly, breaking the rules by stepping into this room. It had been an impulse, a sudden, overwhelming need to comfort the child. She had lost her own, after all, and in a way, helping Marco felt like a way of healing the wound that had never quite closed. But now, with Dominic standing there, she wondered if she had done something wrong, if she had overstepped, if he would punish her for it. Yet, the longer she stood there, the more she realized that this wasn't the man she had grown accustomed to seeing. The ruthless mafia boss, the man who struck fear into everyone he encountered, was gone. In his place was a father, a man who had lost something precious, just as she had. After a long, quiet moment, Dominic finally spoke. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as if he were carefully choosing his words. "What did you do?" he asked, his gaze softening as he looked at the baby, now calm in Jasmine's arms. Jasmine hesitated, not sure how to answer. She wasn't sure she had an explanation, but she knew this. She had done what any mother would do. She had given comfort. "He was in pain," she said quietly. "I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze flickering back to her. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that exchange, Jasmine saw something she hadn't expected: respect. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as though the world outside had paused, and for this fleeting moment, nothing else mattered. Dominic finally broke the silence, his voice more steady now. "Thank you," he said, his tone sincere. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything he had ever said to her before. Jasmine blinked, surprised by the gratitude in his voice. She had never expected anything from him, not praise, not thanks. She had only done what felt right. Yet, hearing those words made something stir in her chest. The weight of her grief, the loss of her own child, felt lighter in that moment. Dominic stepped closer, his eyes still on Marco. "You can stay," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You're not going anywhere." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat, unsure if she had heard him correctly. He didn't mean she could stay in her role as a maid, did he? He didn't mean she would be allowed to remain in his home as though nothing had changed? But as Dominic turned away, walking toward the door, she knew he had meant exactly what he said. And as she stood there with Marco in her arms, a small part of her, perhaps the part that had been broken for so long, felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place in this cold, intimidating world where she could be more than just invisible, more than just a maid, more than just a shadow. As Dominic left the room, he paused at the door, glancing back at Jasmine. "Take care of him," he said, his voice softer now, almost tender. Jasmine nodded, though she wasn't sure if he was talking about Marco or about something else. She looked down at the baby in her arms, feeling a strange sense of responsibility wash over her. This wasn't just about caring for a child. This was about something bigger, something she hadn't even begun to understand yet. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she might be able to. She stood there, holding Marco close, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. It had been a week since the moment that changed everything. Jasmine Carter stood in the kitchen of the Castellano mansion, her hands gently wiping down the countertop as her thoughts drifted back to the strange shift in her life. Dominic had given her permission to stay, to remain in the mansion not just as a maid, but as someone who had done something. Something that had earned her a place here, in this space, in this world. The weight of that gesture still felt surreal. She had expected punishment. She had expected to be reprimanded or worse, thrown out. But Dominic had surprised her. The mafia boss who had controlled the city, who struck fear into anyone who dared cross him, had softened. He had shown kindness. Unexpected, raw kindness. It wasn't something she could easily wrap her head around. But it was real. The week that followed had been strange, a mix of the ordinary and the extraordinary. Jasmine continued her duties, cleaning the grand rooms and tending to the needs of the Castellano family. But now there was a subtle shift. She wasn't just invisible anymore. She had been seen, acknowledged, and it made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Every day, she passed Dominic in the halls, and each time, his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. At first, she was unsure of what to make of it. Was he simply acknowledging her presence, or was there something more? But the more she saw him, the more she realized that it wasn't just the usual cold, dismissive look that most people gave her. His eyes were softer, more considerate. He had become a man she never expected to understand. His presence was still commanding, but there was a new warmth to it when he spoke to her, a new level of respect. One afternoon, as Jasmine was preparing lunch in the kitchen, she heard Dominic's voice from behind her. "You're doing well, Jasmine," he said, his tone uncharacteristically warm. She froze, the knife she was holding momentarily still in her hand. She had grown used to the coldness of his presence, the aloofness. But this was different. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice slightly shaky, unsure of what to make of his compliment. He didn't reply immediately, but his presence lingered in the room, filling it with something unfamiliar, an unspoken understanding. It wasn't long before he walked away, but that simple exchange lingered with her. Jasmine had become accustomed to being overlooked, dismissed as just a servant. But now, Dominic had not only seen her, but had acknowledged her. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply that simple act had affected her. She wasn't just a maid to him anymore. She was a person. Later that day, as Jasmine was leaving the kitchen to continue with her duties, she found herself face to face with Dominic again. This time, he was standing by the grand staircase, looking down at her with an intensity she couldn't quite place. "How is Marco?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, his eyes focused on her. Jasmine blinked in surprise. "He's well, sir. He's been sleeping more soundly," she replied. Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on her. "Good. He's in good hands with you," he said, his voice steady but filled with something Jasmine couldn't quite identify. "Thank you," she said, her heart skipping a beat. He had never been this open with her, never this human. His words, though simple, carried weight. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. This man, who had once seemed untouchable, unmovable, was showing her a side of himself she never thought existed. It wasn't just a shift in his behavior, it was a shift in how he saw her. Jasmine stood there, a little overwhelmed by the moment. But before she could say anything else, Dominic turned to leave, his presence fading as he walked down the hall. She stood there for a moment longer, processing what had just happened. The thought that Dominic Castellano, one of the most powerful men in the city, had taken the time to check in on her, to speak to her with such sincerity, was something she would have never imagined. But as she went about her day, something inside her had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had entered this mansion months ago, and Dominic wasn't the same man either. It was as if, in the quiet spaces of their shared moments, they had found something that neither had expected. As the days passed, Jasmine continued to care for Marco, tending to his needs with the same devotion she had given to her own daughter. But now, when she looked at Dominic, she saw more than just the Mafia boss. She saw a man who was capable of change, of growth, of understanding. She didn't know what the future held or what this unexpected connection meant, but she knew that for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. And maybe, just maybe, this strange turn of events was the beginning of something new for both of them. The days that followed felt like a slow shift in the very fabric of Jasmine's life. She woke up every morning to the grand mansion, her hands moving with practiced precision as she continued her work. The grand halls that once felt cold and impersonal now seemed to hold a strange sense of belonging. Her thoughts, however, were often consumed by the unspoken changes between her and Dominic. Though they didn't speak of it directly, there was a mutual understanding between them that had formed over the past week. Every time their paths crossed, there was a moment, a brief glance or a quiet word, that spoke volumes. It was as if, in the silence of their shared space, They had begun to understand each other in ways they hadn't before. Jasmine found herself thinking about Dominic more than she cared to admit. The man who once seemed untouchable, who carried the weight of his empire with an air of indifference, was now different. She wasn't sure if it was the way he looked at her or the small gestures that showed he was noticing her, but something had changed. Dominic had always been a man of few words, but his actions, his quiet nods, and the way he watched her with a gaze that seemed to acknowledge her in a way no one else had before made her feel seen. One morning, as Jasmine was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, Dominic entered, his usual presence filling the room. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You're up early," he remarked, his voice steady, yet softer than usual. Jasmine looked up, startled, as if his presence was a jolt to her senses. "I wanted to make sure everything was ready for the day," she replied, her voice calm, though she felt the warmth of his gaze. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thank you," he said simply. It wasn't much, but in that moment, those words felt like more than just gratitude. They felt like recognition. The weight of her service, the quiet sacrifice she had made over the past weeks, seemed to be acknowledged in that simple exchange. Dominic didn't often express his appreciation in such a way. Jasmine had gotten used to his stoic silence and occasional commands, but now, there was something more. Later that day, as she was walking through the grand hallway, she heard a faint sound behind her. She turned to find Dominic walking toward her, his footsteps measured and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his gaze shifting down to where she stood. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "about what you did for Marco." Jasmine blinked, surprised by his words. I didn't think it was anything special," she replied, her voice unsure. Dominic shook his head, a rare softness in his expression. You helped him when no one else could." There was a pause as he seemed to search her face, as though trying to understand something deeper. "I've never seen him calm down like that before." His words hit Jasmine harder than she expected. She had been so focused on doing what she thought was right that she hadn't considered how much her actions had affected Dominic, or his son. Marco had been in pain, and Jasmine had done what any mother would have done. But hearing Dominic's acknowledgement made her realize that it wasn't just the child she had helped. She had reached him in a way no one else had. In that moment, something shifted again between them. Dominic's usual cold, calculating demeanor had cracked just enough to reveal a deeper layer of vulnerability, one that he kept hidden behind his powerful facade. Jasmine wasn't sure what to make of it, but it made her feel something warm, something unfamiliar. A few days later, Dominic approached her again, this time with a proposal. "I need you to stay with Marco for the evening," he said. "I have an important meeting, and he's been asking for you." The request was simple, yet it spoke volumes. He trusted her to be with his son when he wasn't around, to care for him in a way that no one else had been able to. It was a subtle yet significant shift. Dominic was no longer just the Mafia boss, and Jasmine wasn't just the maid. They had crossed a line that blurred the boundaries of their roles. That evening, as Jasmine sat by Marco's side, watching him sleep peacefully, she couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come in such a short time. The cold, imposing figure of Dominic Castellano had slowly revealed a man capable of care, of tenderness. And she had found herself a place in his world, no longer invisible, no longer just a servant, but someone who mattered. In the silence of the room, Jasmine felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She wasn't sure where this newfound connection would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the future. Whatever it was, she was ready to face it, alongside Dominic, alongside Marco, in this strange new world they had begun to create together. The days had begun to blend together in a way that felt almost too normal, considering the life Jasmine had known before coming to the Castellano mansion. Yet, despite the routine, there was an undeniable shift in the air, one that she could not ignore. It was subtle at first, in the way Dominic would occasionally glance her way, or the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. It wasn't like the distant, transactional tone he had used in the past. Something had changed, something deeper that neither of them acknowledged aloud, but it was there, between the moments they shared. Jasmine had never imagined this would be her life. She had been a motherless child, raised in a world that had never offered her much beyond struggle. Yet here she was, standing in the heart of a powerful empire, no longer invisible, no longer just a servant. But as the days passed, she began to wonder, was she truly part of this world, or was she still just playing a role? One evening, as she stood by the window in the kitchen, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she caught sight of Dominic walking across the yard. His broad shoulders, the confident stride that had always marked his presence, seemed softer today. There was a slight weariness in his posture, as if the weight of his world, once so steady, had become a little heavier. She watched him for a moment longer before he disappeared into the main house. A sense of uncertainty lingered in her chest. The life she had built here had begun to intertwine with her own in ways that left her conflicted. She had been raised in a world where survival meant maintaining distance from others. Yet Dominic had somehow bridged that gap, pulling her into a space where she had begun to feel something she hadn't felt in years: connection. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Dominic standing in the doorway, his gaze not as piercing as usual, but instead filled with something gentler, more open. "Jasmine," he said, his voice low and steady. "Can you come with me? Marco's awake." It wasn't a request, but there was no command in his tone either. It was an invitation. Without thinking, she nodded and followed him down the hallway. They walked in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. There was an ease to it now, as if they were both learning to navigate this new dynamic between them. When they reached Marco's room, Dominic pushed the door open, revealing the small child sitting up in his crib. Marco's wide eyes locked onto Jasmine immediately, his tiny hands reaching out for her. Without a word, Jasmine moved to him, lifting him from the crib and cradling him in her arms. As she held him, she could feel Dominic's gaze on her, soft yet intense. It was the same feeling she had experienced when she had nursed Marco weeks ago, the unspoken connection between them. "He's been asking for you," Dominic said quietly, watching them with a mixture of admiration and something else. Jasmine smiled softly, settling Marco comfortably against her. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Instead, she rocked him gently, her thoughts drifting. It was moments like this that made her realize how deeply she had become entangled in this life. She wasn't just helping. She wasn't just filling a role. She was becoming a part of something that, until recently, had felt completely out of reach. Dominic stepped closer, his presence filling the room in a way that was no longer intimidating. "Thank you," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual, as though the weight of those words meant more than they ever had before. "For everything." Jasmine looked up at him, surprised. She hadn't expected such sincerity from him. He was a man of few words, and when he spoke, it was often with a calculated precision. But this was different. He wasn't just thanking her for her care of Marco. He was acknowledging her, really acknowledging her. And in that moment, something inside Jasmine shifted. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't just the woman who had been hired to care for a child. She was someone who mattered, someone who had earned his respect. The silence that followed was comfortable, familiar even. As Jasmine continued to rock Marco, she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the child she held. It was a warmth that came from being seen, from being valued, from knowing that, for the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. Dominic turned to leave, but before he stepped out of the room, he paused, looking back at her with a quiet intensity. "You're not just a maid to me, Jasmine," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that caught her off guard. "You've earned more than that." She felt her heart skip a beat, unsure of how to respond. She had been seen before, but never like this. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. Dominic nodded, his eyes softening. "Get some rest, Jasmine. I'll take care of everything else tonight." With that, he left the room, leaving Jasmine standing there, Marco in her arms, feeling like the walls of the mansion had shifted, just a little bit, to make space for her. It was a small change, a quiet moment, but it meant everything. In that room, with Marco nestled against her, she realized something she hadn't before. This was her life now. Not as a maid, not as someone who simply existed in the background, but as someone who had a place here, in this world. And maybe, just maybe, that was all she needed. The following week, something shifted in the mansion. Jasmine had always kept to herself, focused on her duties and the quiet routine that had become her life. But now, the mansion felt different. It was subtle at first, but the moments she shared with Dominic were no longer fleeting or transactional. There was a new understanding between them, one that neither had voiced, but both knew was there. It was in the way he looked at her when she entered a room, the quiet moments of acknowledgement that had once been absent. He no longer seemed like the cold, imposing Mafia boss. Instead, he felt more human, more real. Jasmine wasn't sure if it was the weight of the time they had spent together or the bond they had formed over their shared experiences, but something had definitely changed. Dominic had begun to trust her in ways he hadn't with anyone before. One evening, as she was finishing up her chores, she heard a soft knock on the door to the kitchen. She turned to find Dominic standing there, his posture casual, but his eyes searching. "Jasmine," he began, his voice carrying a new warmth that made her heart skip a beat. "I need your help with something." Jasmine set the dish she had been cleaning aside. Her curiosity piqued. "Of course, what do you need?" Dominic stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His usual composure was there, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something personal. "It's Marco," he said, his gaze softening. "He's been asking for you, and I think he needs someone who's not as—" He trailed off, struggling to find the words. "Not as what?" Jasmine asked, her voice gentle, not wanting to push him but wanting to understand. Dominic hesitated for a moment, then met her eyes. "Not as distant. He's been different since you've been with him. I think he's starting to trust you in a way he hasn't with anyone else." Jasmine felt a surge of emotion at his words. She had always tried to care for Marco as best as she could, but hearing Dominic say that, hearing him acknowledge what she had done for his son, made her heart swell with an emotion she hadn't expected. "I'm happy to help," she said, her voice steady. Dominic nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. "Thank you," he said quietly, before turning to leave. But as he reached the door, he paused. "Jasmine," he said again, his voice low. She turned back to him, meeting his gaze. "I'm glad you're here," he added, his tone sincere. It was the first time he had said anything like that to her. His words were simple, but they carried a weight she wasn't used to. It was a quiet acknowledgement of her place in this world, in his world. And for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, Jasmine allowed herself to feel like she belonged. That night, she stayed with Marco longer than usual, watching over him as he slept soundly in his crib. Her thoughts drifted back to the man who had allowed her to stay, to be a part of his life in a way she never expected. Dominic Castellano, the Mafia boss, was not what she had imagined him to be. He had shown her a side of himself that few ever saw. Tender, protective, and, despite everything, human. The next day, as Jasmine walked through the mansion, she was once again met with Dominic's gaze. This time, it was different. There was no coldness, no authority in his eyes, just a quiet understanding. He nodded at her as she passed, a simple gesture, but one that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. As the days turned into weeks, their unspoken bond continued to grow. Jasmine's role in the mansion had shifted, not just as a maid or a caretaker, but as someone who had earned Dominic's trust. And with that trust came something she hadn't expected, a sense of belonging. She was no longer just a shadow in the background. She was a part of something bigger. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, Dominic entered the kitchen again. This time, his steps were more deliberate, and his presence felt even more pronounced. He didn't speak immediately, but when he did, his voice was softer than usual. "Jasmine," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've been thinking." She paused what she was doing, her heart skipping a beat. "About what?" she asked, turning to face him fully. "About us," he said, his voice steady. Jasmine blinked, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he continued, "but I want you to know that you matter here. More than just as Marco's caretaker, more than just as a maid. You've earned more than that." His words took her by surprise. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. All she had ever known was a life of working to survive, of keeping her head down and blending into the background. But here, in this mansion, with Dominic, she felt like she had finally found her place. "I didn't expect this," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion she hadn't realized was there. "I didn't expect to be seen." Dominic stepped closer, his expression softening. "You deserve to be seen," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Jasmine's heart swelled as she met his gaze, understanding something deeper than she had ever realized. Dominic wasn't just offering her a place in his world. He was offering her a chance to be more than what she had been before, to be someone who was valued, someone who was seen, and most importantly, someone who mattered. For the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt like she wasn't just existing. She was living. And as she stood there, facing Dominic, she realized that this was only the beginning. The days passed with a sense of ease that Jasmine had never experienced before. The mansion, once a place of distance and quiet, had transformed into a place of warmth. Each day, Dominic's presence felt less intimidating and more familiar. They had shared so many quiet moments together, exchanges that spoke volumes without the need for words. It was as if they were both learning to navigate a new world, a world where trust, understanding, and vulnerability were possible between them. As she moved through the halls, Jasmine noticed how differently people treated her now. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was someone with a role in the house, someone who had a purpose beyond cleaning and taking care of things. There was a shift in the way the staff interacted with her, a quiet acknowledgement of her place in the mansion. It wasn't just Dominic who had seen her. Everyone had started to notice the change in her. One afternoon, as Jasmine walked through the gardens with Marco, she couldn't help but smile as the child giggled, his small hands reaching out to touch the flowers. The sun was setting, casting a soft, golden light over everything. It was one of those peaceful moments that made everything feel right in the world. As she sat down on a nearby bench, cradling Marco in her arms, she reflected on how far she had come since her first days here. Back then, she had been nothing more than a shadow in the mansion, a servant who blended into the background. But now, she was someone who mattered. She was part of this world in a way that felt real and permanent. Dominic had made that possible. Just then, she heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, she saw him walking toward her, his usual confident stride tempered with a new kind of gentleness. "You're out here alone?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Jasmine smiled and shook her head. "Not alone," she said, glancing down at Marco, who was still playing with the flowers. Dominic smiled back, his eyes softening as he looked at the child. "How is he?" he asked, his voice filled with a tenderness that surprised Jasmine. "He's doing well," she replied. "He's been asking for you." The words hung between them, and for a moment, they both simply watched Marco, who was now trying to grab a butterfly that fluttered nearby. Dominic stood silently beside her, and Jasmine couldn't help but notice how his presence had changed. He wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He was a father. He was someone who cared. "Jasmine," Dominic finally said, breaking the silence. "I've been thinking." She looked up at him, waiting for him to continue. "About everything," he added. "About how you've been with Marco. How much you've done for him. I'm grateful." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and it struck her in a way she wasn't prepared for. She had never imagined that this powerful man would ever acknowledge her so directly, let alone express his gratitude. "It's nothing," she replied, her voice soft. "I'm just doing what's needed." Dominic shook his head, his eyes locking with hers. "It's not nothing. You've made a difference, Jasmine. You've made a real difference." The weight of his words settled over her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to fully process what they meant. She had made a difference in his life, in Marco's life. She wasn't just a part of the staff. She was someone who had impacted them in a profound way. "Thank you," Dominic added quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "For everything." Jasmine swallowed, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her up. She had never expected anything in return for her actions, but hearing those words from him, hearing the sincerity behind them, made her realize just how much she had been given in return. She had been seen, truly seen, by the one person who could have easily dismissed her. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Dominic said firmly, his tone soft but resolute. "You're doing much more than that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, side by side, watching Marco as he continued to explore the garden. The silence between them was no longer awkward or filled with uncertainty. It was comfortable, a reflection of the understanding they had found in each other. "I'm glad you're here, Jasmine," Dominic said quietly, his words carrying a weight that went beyond simple gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The sincerity in his voice was like nothing she had ever heard from him before. Jasmine turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his with a depth that felt new. "You don't have to say that," she replied softly, but inside, she felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just about the gratitude he expressed. It was the recognition of their shared connection, the bond that had formed between them over time. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I mean it," he said finally. "You've earned more than just my gratitude. You've earned my respect." Jasmine didn't know how to respond. The words were more than she had ever expected from him, and they made her feel something deep inside, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. As she sat there with Marco in her arms, Dominic standing beside her, she realized that this moment was the culmination of everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. She wasn't just a maid in a mansion anymore. She was someone who had found a place in this world, a place where she mattered. And for the first time, she truly believed it. It had been several weeks since the moment that changed everything, and Jasmine still couldn't quite shake the feeling that things had shifted in ways she had never expected. The mansion, once a place of cold indifference, now felt more like home than she had ever imagined. She moved through the rooms with a newfound sense of purpose, no longer just a servant, but someone who had a place in the lives of those she cared for. Marco had grown more attached to her, his trust in her deepening with each passing day. He was no longer the distant, crying child she had first met. He was now a bright, inquisitive boy who sought her out for comfort and guidance. And Dominic had become more than just the man who ran the empire. He had become someone she could rely on, someone who, despite the walls he had built around himself, had shown her a side of him that was softer, more human. Their interactions, once limited to brief exchanges, had become more meaningful. There were moments now, quiet moments, where they would sit together, not speaking, but simply being in each other's company. And those moments spoke volumes. One evening, as Jasmine sat with Marco in the nursery, watching the boy play with his toys, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to find Dominic standing in the doorway, his expression neutral, but his eyes soft. He looked at her for a moment, his gaze lingering on the child in her arms. "How is he?" Dominic asked, his voice carrying a hint of concern. Jasmine smiled as she looked at Marco, who was now stacking blocks with concentrated effort. "He's doing better," she replied, her voice filled with warmth. "He's been asking for you." Dominic nodded, a small smile appearing on his lips. "I'll spend some time with him tomorrow," he said, his tone steady. It wasn't just the words that caught Jasmine's attention, though. It was the way he said them. It was as though he truly meant it. As though he had found a way to connect with his son, in a way that he hadn't before. And Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest at the thought. As the days passed, Dominic continued to make an effort to spend time with Marco. It wasn't just about being a father in name anymore. He was present, in every sense of the word. He played with Marco, he cared for him, and most importantly, he listened to him. Jasmine watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride as she saw the relationship between father and son grow. She had never imagined that the man who had seemed so cold, so distant, would be capable of such tenderness. But here he was, proving her wrong in the most beautiful way. One afternoon, as she walked through the garden, she saw Dominic sitting on a bench, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He looked lost in thought, a rare vulnerability in his posture. Jasmine hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should interrupt, but then she decided to approach him. She sat beside him, not saying a word, simply being there with him. After a long moment, Dominic spoke, his voice quiet. "I never thought I'd be here, Jasmine. I never thought I'd be this person." His words surprised her. She turned to him, meeting his gaze. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. Dominic let out a sigh, his eyes filled with an emotion Jasmine couldn't quite place. "I built this empire with my own 2 hands," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet bitterness. "I've always been in control, always been the one calling the shots. But with Marco, with you, I don't know. I've never felt so out of control. And yet, for the first time, I don't mind." Jasmine's heart swelled with empathy. She had always known that Dominic's life was complicated, that the power he wielded came with a heavy burden. But hearing him speak so openly about it, about the way he had changed, made her realize just how far he had come. "You're not alone in this," Jasmine said softly, her voice filled with reassurance. "You have Marco. You have me." Dominic looked at her, his eyes softening. "I didn't expect to need anyone," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But somehow, You've made me realize that maybe I do." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jasmine could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the same vulnerability she had seen in herself. He wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He was a man who had learned to open his heart, to trust, and to love. And she was a part of that journey. In that moment, she realized something important. She had found her place in his world, not because of her duties or her role, but because she had become someone who mattered to him. And that, more than anything, was what made all the difference. As they sat together in silence, Jasmine felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had found a family here, a family that wasn't defined by blood or titles, but by the bonds they had forged through love and trust. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The weeks that followed felt like a strange blend of the ordinary and the extraordinary. Jasmine had never imagined that her life would take such a turn. The mansion, which had once been a place of isolation and cold professionalism, now felt like a home in a way she had never experienced before. The warmth that had once been absent had gradually settled into the space around her, and with it came the feeling of belonging. Every morning, she woke with a sense of purpose, no longer just a maid, but someone who had a place in this world. Her relationship with Dominic had continued to evolve in ways that were both subtle and profound. It wasn't just about the daily interactions or the shared responsibilities with Marco. It was in the quiet moments, the glances exchanged across the room, and the unspoken understanding between them. There was no need for words anymore. They had come to a mutual recognition of the bond they had formed, a bond that transcended their roles and their pasts. Jasmine found herself growing more confident in her place in this world. Her duties around the mansion had expanded, and with each task, she felt a deeper sense of connection to the life she had built here. But there were still moments when she felt the weight of her past, the struggles she had faced before coming to the mansion, the life she had left behind. Yet, those feelings of doubt were becoming fewer, replaced by a sense of stability and purpose. One evening, as Jasmine stood by the window in the sitting room, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had first arrived at the mansion, uncertain of her place and unsure of her future. But now, everything had changed. She had found a family here, one that wasn't defined by blood, but by the connections they had forged over time. As she turned away from the window, she saw Dominic entering the room. His usual confident stride had softened over the months, and today, there was a quiet exhaustion in his expression. He had become a man who was no longer just the ruthless Mafia boss, but someone who had found a new rhythm in his life, a life that included her, included Marco, and included something deeper than power and control. "Jasmine," he said, his voice carrying a rare note of vulnerability. "Can we talk for a minute?" She turned to face him, her heart beating a little faster. It was rare for Dominic to seek her out like this, away from the usual context of the mansion's daily activities. She nodded, walking toward him. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady. Dominic sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze lowering to the floor. "About everything. About you, about Marco, about us." Jasmine felt her pulse quicken at his words. She didn't speak, giving him the space to continue. "I never thought I'd be here," he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "I never thought I'd be able to trust anyone like this. I've always been isolated. I built this empire, this life, but it was always at a distance. I never allowed myself to get too close to anyone, not even Marco, not even you." Jasmine's heart ached at the rawness in his words. She knew how much Dominic had carried, how much he had sacrificed to build the life he now had. She had seen the walls he had built around himself, and how, little by little, those walls had started to come down. She took a step toward him, her voice gentle. "You don't have to be alone anymore," she said softly. Dominic looked up at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. "I don't want to be," he admitted, his voice raw. "I don't want to be the man I've been anymore. But I don't know how to change. I don't know how to let people in without feeling like I'm losing control." Jasmine placed a hand on his arm, her touch soft and reassuring. "You don't have to lose control," she said. "You just have to let people help. Let them be there for you, like you've been there for Marco and for me." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of their words settling between them. Dominic's eyes softened as he looked at her, and in that moment, Jasmine saw a vulnerability in him that she hadn't seen before. It was as though he had finally allowed himself to acknowledge that he wasn't invincible, that he didn't have to carry the world on his shoulders alone. "You've helped me more than you know," he said quietly, his voice filled with a depth of emotion she hadn't expected. "I never thought I could trust anyone like this. But with you it feels different." Jasmine smiled softly, her heart swelling at his words. "You don't have to thank me," she replied, her voice warm. "I'm just doing what feels right." Dominic took a deep breath, and for the first time, she saw him truly exhale, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice steady. "But I know I don't want to do it alone." Jasmine nodded, her hand still resting on his arm. "You don't have to." The silence that followed was no longer heavy with uncertainty, but filled with the promise of something new. In that moment, Dominic Castellano, the man who had built his empire on power and control, was no longer alone. He had found something worth fighting for, a family, a place where he could truly be himself, and someone who cared for him in ways he never thought possible. As they stood there, side by side, Jasmine knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one that was built on trust, love, and the kind of connection they had both longed for without even realizing it. The days continued to pass, and the feeling of change in the mansion grew even more palpable. It was no longer just about the tasks Jasmine had to complete. It wasn't just about taking care of Marco or making sure everything was in order. It was about the way Dominic looked at her now, the way his presence filled the room in a different way. There was no more distance between them, no more invisible walls. Their connection had deepened in ways she hadn't expected. Jasmine found herself waking up each morning with a sense of purpose that went beyond the usual duties. She had become someone who mattered, not just to the household, but to Dominic. Their bond, once unspoken, was now undeniable. Dominic, too, had changed in the quietest of ways. The man who had once ruled his empire with icy precision now seemed more human, more approachable. He had let go of some of the armor he had worn for so long. He was still the strong, authoritative figure who commanded respect, but now there was a softness to him, a vulnerability that he had never allowed himself to show before. It wasn't just his son, Marco, who had benefited from this change. Jasmine had too. One evening, as Jasmine was sitting with Marco in the nursery, the boy's small hands playing with his favorite toys, Dominic came to the door. He didn't knock, just stood there for a moment, watching them. Jasmine looked up and smiled, and in that moment, everything felt right. There was a comfort in the silence between them, one that had developed over the course of their time together. "He's doing well," Jasmine said softly, her eyes meeting Dominic's. Dominic nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "I can see that," he replied, his voice low warm. He stepped inside, walking over to where Marco sat, his small hands reaching up for him. Dominic bent down and scooped Marco into his arms, cradling him with a tenderness that surprised Jasmine. It was a side of him that she hadn't seen before, and in that moment, she understood just how much Dominic had changed. As Dominic sat beside her, Marco nestled in his arms. The three of them simply sat together in a comfortable silence. The weight of the past few months, the awkwardness, the uncertainty, had faded. What remained was something simpler, something more genuine. Jasmine couldn't help but smile as she watched Dominic with Marco. It was a look of pure affection, the kind of love that only a parent could have for their child. It wasn't about power or control. It was about caring, about being present. And in that moment, Jasmine realized just how far they had come, not only as individuals, but as a family. She had never imagined that her life would take such a turn, that the man who had once been so distant, so unapproachable, would become someone she could trust, someone she could rely on. The man who had built an empire on power was now someone who cared about her, about Marco, and about what they had together. As the evening wore on, Dominic stood, holding Marco close. "I think he's ready for bed," he said, his voice gentle. Jasmine nodded, standing up and offering to help him. But Dominic shook his head. "I've got it," he said, his gaze soft. "Thank you, though." Jasmine watched as Dominic took Marco to his crib, his movements tender and careful. It was a quiet moment, but one that spoke volumes. There was no longer a barrier between them. They were no longer two people navigating a complicated situation. They were a family in their own way. Later that night, as Jasmine lay in her room, the weight of the day settled around her. She closed her eyes, thinking about the moments they had shared, about how far they had come, about how much had changed. She had never imagined that her life would take such a turn, that she would find a place where she mattered, where she was seen, not just as someone who took care of others, but as someone who was a part of something. Dominic had given her that. But more than that, he had shown her that she was capable of so much more than she had ever believed. She had built a life here, one that was no longer defined by her past struggles or her role as a servant. She had found a home, a place where she was valued, where she could be herself. The realization hit her then, and she let out a deep breath. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and that was more than she had ever dreamed of. The next morning, as Jasmine made her way through the mansion, she couldn't help but feel a sense of calm that had eluded her for so long. There was no more uncertainty, no more fear of being left behind. She had found her place, and she wasn't going anywhere. As she passed Dominic in the hallway, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, everything around them faded away. There was nothing more to say. They didn't need words. They were both in this together. And that was enough. Jasmine continued on her way, a small smile on her lips. For the first time in her life, she felt at peace. She had found a family, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that mattered. And she knew, with certainty, that she had a future. Here, a future she had never dreamed possible. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life in the mansion began to feel like a steady beat. Calm, familiar, and comfortable. Jasmine's role had evolved in ways she had never expected. Once, she had been just a caretaker, a face among many, a silent presence who blended into the background. But now, she was more than that. She was an integral part of the family, her bond with Marco growing stronger each day, and with Dominic, there was an unspoken connection that neither of them could ignore. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about the shared moments, the quiet exchanges, and the growing trust between them. Each day, Jasmine saw Dominic differently. He was still the powerful Mafia boss, but now, when she looked at him, she saw more than just the leader of an empire. She saw a man who had learned to open up, to show vulnerability in ways he never had before. And it wasn't just with her. He had become more present for Marco, more engaged, more involved. It was as if he was rediscovering his capacity for love and connection, and it was something that had slowly started to shape him into a man he hadn't known he could be. One evening, as Jasmine walked through the mansion, she saw Dominic standing by the window, looking out over the grounds. His posture was relaxed, his usually tense shoulders a little less rigid. For a moment, he didn't seem like the man who commanded fear and respect. He seemed like someone else, someone real. She stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure if she should interrupt his quiet moment. But Dominic turned and caught her eye before she could move. "Come here, Jasmine," he said, his voice low but warm. She stepped into the room, walking toward him slowly. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Dominic nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he wasn't entirely at ease. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone thoughtful. "About everything. About how things have changed." Jasmine watched him closely, sensing the weight behind his words. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Dominic exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I've spent so much of my life focused on control, on building this empire, on making sure nothing ever got out of hand. But, somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really matters. I forgot about the people I care about. I forgot about you." Jasmine felt a flutter in her chest at his words. She had never imagined that Dominic would open up to her like this. He was the man who ruled with iron fists, who showed no weakness to anyone, not even to those closest to him. But now, here he was, admitting something she hadn't expected. "I didn't realize how much you had become a part of my life," he continued, his voice quiet. "I didn't realize how much I needed you, Jasmine." The sincerity in his words took her by surprise. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. It wasn't the kind of conversation she had ever expected to have with him. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the man who had been so guarded, so distant, finally acknowledging the connection they had built. "I'm just here to help," Jasmine said softly, her voice steady, but filled with warmth. "I never expected anything in return. Dominic stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've done more than just help," he said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "You've changed things for me. For Marco. For all of us." Jasmine swallowed, the weight of his words settling around her. She had never thought of herself as someone who could change a man like Dominic, someone who had built an empire on power and control. But somewhere along the way, she had become a part of his life in a way she couldn't have imagined. And in return, he had changed her life too. The dynamic between them had evolved into something deeper, something more meaningful than either of them had anticipated. As they stood in the quiet of the room, Jasmine realized that this wasn't just about the role she had in the mansion. It was about the life they were building together, the trust they had formed, and the love that had slowly begun to take root. It was something neither of them had expected, but something they both desperately needed. "You've given me a chance to be more than I was," Dominic said, his voice filled with raw emotion. "You've helped me remember what it's like to care, to love, to be human again." Jasmine's heart ached at his words. She had never seen him so vulnerable, so open. But it wasn't a weakness. It was strength in its truest form. Dominic wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He was a father, a man who had learned to be more than just the sum of his power. He had learned to care. And in doing so, he had shown Jasmine that there was more to life than survival. There was something worth living for. Dominic reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, but filled with deep gratitude. "For everything." Jasmine looked at him, her heart full, her thoughts a jumble of emotions. "I'm just doing what's right," she said softly. Dominic nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "And that's more than I ever expected." In that moment, Jasmine knew that whatever the future held, she and Dominic had already crossed a threshold. They were no longer just two people caught in a complicated situation. They were a family, in their own way. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. With trust, with love, and with a shared understanding of the power of connection. The mansion had become a place of peace in a way Jasmine never thought possible. It was no longer just the home of a powerful man, a man who had built an empire from the ground up. It was a place where love and trust were cultivated, where she had found more than just a role. She had found a family. Marco had blossomed in ways Jasmine could hardly believe. He was no longer the frightened, uncertain child she had met months ago. He was now a boy full of curiosity, laughter, and a warmth that filled every corner of the mansion. And it wasn't just Jasmine who had changed him. It was Dominic too. The man who had once been cold and distant had shown Marco what it meant to be cared for, to be loved without conditions. Dominic's growth, his willingness to open up to the people around him, had made all the difference. He had stepped into a role he hadn't known he could fulfill, not just as a father, but as a protector, a guide, and a partner. And Jasmine, who had arrived with nothing but her own strength and determination, had found a place where she was not just seen but valued. Her days in the mansion were no longer just about completing tasks. She had found herself in a position of influence, not because of her role, but because of the person she had become through the connection with Dominic and Marco. One evening, as the sun set and the mansion bathed in the warm glow of twilight, Jasmine found herself sitting in the garden, watching the soft ripples of the fountain dance in the fading light. She had always loved this time of day, the quiet moments when the world seemed to slow down. It was during one of these quiet moments that Dominic came to her. He had been busy, as usual, but tonight, he seemed different. He approached her slowly, his steps deliberate. There was something about him that night, something that made her pause and take notice. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He simply stood there for a moment, looking out at the horizon with her. The silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, a reflection of the bond they had built over time. "Jasmine," he finally said, his voice low, almost contemplative. "I've been thinking about a lot of things. About how far we've come." She turned to him, her heart beating a little faster at his words. It had become rare for him to speak so openly, so personally. "I never imagined this," Dominic continued, his eyes meeting hers. "I didn't think I could change, didn't think I could be the man I've become. But here we are, and I don't want to go back to the way things were." Jasmine's heart swelled at his words. She had never thought that Dominic would be the one to change. She had assumed that he was as unyielding as the empire he had built. But now, Here he was, acknowledging the shift that had occurred between them. You don't have to, she said softly, her voice gentle but firm. You've already come so far. Dominic smiled faintly, his eyes softening. I didn't think it was possible to trust someone like this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I trust you, Jasmine. With Marco. With everything. The words hit her harder than she expected. Trust. It was a word that had been foreign to her for so long, something she had given up on. She had spent her life surviving, fighting against a world that had never seemed to care. But now, Dominic was offering her something she had never asked for, his trust, his belief in her. I never thought I would say this, Dominic continued, his gaze growing more intense. But you've changed everything. You've made me see what I was missing, what I could be. Jasmine swallowed, trying to keep her composure, trying not to let the overwhelming emotions inside her spill out. She had never expected to hear these words from him. She had never expected to have this kind of effect on someone like Dominic Castellano. It's not just me, she said softly, her voice steady. It's you too. You've changed too. You've shown Marco what it means to have a father who cares. And you've shown me what it means to trust. Dominic stepped closer, his hand gently brushing against hers. I'm grateful for that, he said, his voice barely audible. Grateful for you. Jasmine felt the warmth of his touch spread through her, a sense of connection that was deeper than she had ever imagined. In that moment, she realized that this, what they had, wasn't just about duty or responsibility. It was about love. It was about something real, something lasting. And for the first time in her life, Jasmine felt like she truly belonged. We've built something here, Dominic said quietly, looking down at her hand, now resting in his. Something worth fighting for. Jasmine nodded, her heart full of gratitude. I agree, she whispered. In the silence that followed, the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them, standing together in the garden, their hands intertwined. They had both come so far, had both changed in ways they had never expected. But in that moment, it didn't matter what the future held. What mattered was that they had found each other, and together, they were stronger than they had ever been apart. As the sun set on the mansion, the promise of a new beginning settled between them, unspoken but understood. The future was theirs to create, and together, they would face whatever came their way. The days passed, each one unfolding like a chapter in a story neither Jasmine nor Dominic could have predicted. They had both come so far, so much had changed, and yet, as the weeks slipped by, their bond only seemed to grow deeper. The mansion, once a place of separation and cold, now felt like a home that they had built together, in ways neither had truly anticipated. Jasmine had found a sense of belonging she had never imagined. In a world where she had always been the outsider, the maid, she had become a person of significance. She wasn't just seen anymore. She mattered. And it wasn't just because of the work she did. It was because of who she had become in the eyes of the people around her, especially Dominic. He had seen her, really seen her, and that made all the difference. Dominic, too, had changed. The man who had built an empire based on power and control was no longer the same man. He had softened in ways that were subtle but profound. Jasmine saw him not just as the ruthless Mafia boss anymore, but as a father, a man capable of love, trust, and even vulnerability. They had both grown together, but the foundation they had built was still fragile. It was a bond that neither of them could have predicted, but one that they both knew was worth fighting for. One evening, as the moonlight bathed the mansion in a soft glow, Dominic found Jasmine standing by the window, looking out at the garden. He could see her silhouette, her face illuminated by the light, and for a moment, he simply watched her. He had never imagined he could feel this way about someone. He had never imagined he could let someone in, let them see the parts of him he had kept hidden for so long. But Jasmine had done that. She had done what no one else could. She had shown him that it was okay to let go of the walls he had built, the walls that had protected him for so long. He walked over to her, his steps quiet against the marble floors. When he reached her side, he stood there for a moment, looking out at the same view she had been admiring. It's beautiful, isn't it? He said, his voice low, almost reverent. Jasmine nodded, her eyes still fixed on the garden. It is, she replied softly. There was a quiet moment between them before Dominic spoke again. I've been thinking, he said, his tone hesitant, as though he were still unsure how to fully express what he was feeling. About everything. About you. About us. Jasmine turned to face him, her heart skipping a beat. She had grown used to Dominic's confidence, his power, but there was something different about him tonight. Something vulnerable, something raw. What about us? She asked gently, her voice filled with curiosity. Dominic met her gaze, his eyes softer than they had ever been. I never thought I could be this open with anyone, especially not with someone like you. Jasmine felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never heard him speak like this, and it touched her more deeply than she expected. I've spent so much of my life closed off, only focused on what I could control, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But with you, it's different. You've made me realize that there's more to life than just power. There's love. There's trust. And I've never trusted anyone like I trust you. Jasmine's heart ached at his words. She had never imagined that someone like Dominic, someone who had always been so strong, so guarded, would open up to her in this way. It wasn't just about the power he wielded or the empire he ran. It was about the person he had become, someone who could love, who could be vulnerable, who could trust. Dominic, she said softly, her voice filled with warmth and affection. I never thought I would hear you say that. He smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. I didn't think I would say it either, he admitted. But here we are, and I'm not going to pretend anymore. You've changed me, Jasmine, and I'm grateful for that. Jasmine's chest tightened with emotion. She had come to this mansion with nothing, and now she had something more valuable than anything she could have imagined. She had found a place where she mattered, where she was seen and valued. And the man who had once been so distant had become someone she could trust, someone she could love. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. You've changed too, she said, her voice filled with sincerity. I've seen it, and I think you've made us both stronger. Dominic looked down at her hand, his gaze softening. I never thought I could be this man, he said quietly. But I am. Because of you. There was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a peaceful silence, one filled with understanding, with the promise of a future they could build together. Dominic turned to face her fully, his hand gently resting on her cheek. Jasmine, he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. I'm ready to build that future with you. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Jasmine looked up at him, her heart full. Together, she echoed, the word resonating in her soul. And in that moment, they both knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they had already built something stronger than anything they could face. They had built trust, they had built love, and they had built a family.